Not a hoax, not a dream, not an imaginary story. No, it's a fantasy, Phantasy Star, on Segaiden episode 67.
Merry Christmas! Ho, ho, ho!
Merry Christmas, Santa!
Well, it's taken a while, but Sega has finally decided to harness both the potential of its 8-bit console and the potential of its in-house game development team. It's been a long time coming, but Phantasy Star was worth the wait. When people look back at the Master System and assemble lists of essential games that every serious fan must own and play, Phantasy Star invariably comes in at the very top slot, or at least close to it. Europeans sometimes put Wonder Boy 3 or somehow Alex Kidd in the top slot. Incidentally, did you know that it took the EU a few years longer to ban leaded petroleum than it did the US or Japan? But why wouldn't everyone love Phantasy Star? It's a technical marvel, an aesthetic masterpiece, and a damn good example of the role-playing genre that embraces the format's history in a creative, holistic way. In terms of scale and scope of content, Phantasy Star absolutely embarrasses everything that had come before it on Sega's platform. There was nothing like this on Atari's consoles, or on Intellivision either. Even the NES, where developers had cheerfully embraced role-playing influences, couldn't compare to the sheer massiveness of Phantasy Star. Remember, we're talking about November 1988 for the American launch of Phantasy Star, putting it a little ahead of the long-delayed US launch of Zelda 2. The first proper NES role-playing game, not a hybrid action title but a true RPG, wouldn't arrive until the new year with Ultima Exodus. Dragon Warrior was 9 months away. And the one NES RPG that could honestly compete with Phantasy Star in terms of visuals, themes, and polish, Square's Final Fantasy, wouldn't hit until summer of 1990. The reality is that, quite simply, Phantasy Star stood head and shoulders above the competition. Nintendo of America would try so hard to sell its audience on the RPGs that had swept in and taken over the charts in Japan, and they generally failed at it. Sega of America didn't make nearly as big a deal of it, launching Phantasy Star with a modest amount of marketing to do, but otherwise just letting the game speak for itself on its own merits. Heck, Sega didn't even place Phantasy Star as the cover story for fall 1988's Sega Challenge newsletter. It played second banana to Thunderblade, a game that absolutely did not represent the Master System at its best. Phantasy Star appeared as a feature spanning a page and a half, sharing its second page with Carmen Sandiego, and the copy engines it did enjoy offer little more than marketing platitudes and hype. The best they could manage was to offer a $5 rebate for Phantasy Star if you cut out the barcode from its box, along with the UPC codes from 2 other games, a coupon offer that sends chills down the spines of collectors and game preservationists alike. You can understand the impetus there, though, as Phantasy Star's enormous 4 meg ROM and battery backup feature made it, by far, the single most expensive console game on the US market in 1988. The earliest ad I can dig up for it, dating from October 88, lists Phantasy Star for an eye-watering $70. $10 more expensive than the next priciest cart, and only $30 less expensive than the console itself. I have to imagine that presented a real challenge for Sega of America's marketing team, who probably didn't really get Phantasy Star in the first place, having geared their efforts toward promoting Master System as a destination for arcade-style games, sports, and direct coin-op ports. Phantasy Star is none of those things, which is why it has managed to endure the test of time so effectively. Phantasy Star really does stand out as a pivotal moment for Sega's home development efforts. Although the company had been producing original titles for Master System and even SG-1000 from the start, they generally stuck to Sega's strengths. That is, arcade-focused gaming. Which is to say that Sega's home console creations centered on fast action, high difficulty, accessible simplicity. I mean, the best of the Master System's original titles directly referenced coin-op games, like Fantasy Zone 2, a sequel to an arcade game, and Segaiden, just a straight-up Castlevania haunted castle alike. Still, you can see the more expansive design that had taken root on Nintendo's console creeping into even these games. From Fantasy Zone 2's multiple interlinked areas and cache-based inventory system, to Seiden's hidden areas and optional character buffing side challenges, Master System games had begun to explore the idea of letting players do something besides run and shoot and fly in a straight line until things killed them. Even tossing away outliers like the impossible mission-inspired Zillion, you couldn't really escape RPG influences in home games by this point. You thought you were buying a straightforward Wonder Boy sequel, but it was actually a linear action RPG complete with an economy. And Sega needed to adopt this approach for Master System. Not just to keep pace with popular NES releases like Blaster Master, Castlevania 2, and even Super Mario Bros. 2, but also to compensate for the fact that the Master System had sort of been left in the dust by Sega. Sega's console may have whipped NES's ass in terms of raw technical specs, but it had begun to feel creakier than the competition for a couple of reasons. For one thing, Nintendo had slipped a bit of anti-obsolescence design planning into the NES at the hardware level, building the cartridge connector with some additional pins that allowed it to pull extra data from cartridge add-ons, in order to present games that far exceeded the console's base specs, a feature present in a far more limited capacity on Master System. Consider the way that both consoles' Japanese models integrated FM audio enhancements. Nintendo's Famicom made use of its pass-through capabilities to allow Konami's Lagrange point to generate FM sound inside of the cartridge. Sega's Mark III, on the other hand, relied on an external hardware peripheral that could produce FM sound for carts that included program code for the alternate soundtrack. Granted, Sega's approach was a much better deal for fans, since they only had to pay once for the FM system add-on, while Nintendo fans had to pay a premium on each cartridge that included enhancement chips. But the Nintendo approach offered vastly more flexibility, since it allowed developers to integrate all kinds of weird alternate features into their carts, like barcode scanners, a boon for consumers with the stomach to fork over 2, 3, or even 4 times the standard price of a game for those specialized carts. That limitation really put a crimp in Sega's primary marketing pitch for the Master System. The console had come to the US in 1986, boasting the most impressive arcade-to-console conversions ever seen, and understandably so. Sega built the Master System's feature set to go toe-to-toe with the System 1 arcade board, meaning that direct arcade ports weren't simply an aspirational dream for Master System devs, but a legitimate possibility. Well, sort of. By the time the Master System launched, the System 1 had given way to the more impressive System 16, and that in turn paled in comparison to the superscalar boards that powered Hang-On, Space Harrier, and its rapidly evolving children. The Master System could present arcade-accurate games from 5 years ago. When it came to current arcade titles, though, the Master System simply couldn't keep up. Some clever programming hacks made the home conversions of Outrun, Space Harrier, and Shinobi way more convincing than they had any right to be, but there were still only so many Yuji Nakas to go around. The cracks began to appear in the Master System's mission statement with Sega's awful home reinvention of Enduro Racer. The 1-2 gut punch disappointment of Space Harrier 3D and Thunderblade made it clear Sega's coin-op division had moved beyond the Master System. And, as it happens, Phantasy Star would arrive in the US just a few weeks after the Master System's replacement, the 16-bit Mega Drive, landed in Japan. That could have been the end of the Master System story, especially given how poorly the Mark III had fared in Japan. But the system had found decent traction in the West among American, European, and Brazilian audiences. So Sega decided to keep things going for a little while longer. And that meant updating the Master System's driving design philosophy to fit the tastes of console enthusiasts. More depth, more substance, more complexity, and yes, more RPG stuff. Which brings us to Phantasy Star. Now that I've spent the past 8 or 9 minutes making a better business case for the game than Sega of America managed, let's talk about the game itself. Specifically, let's talk about why it kicked ass. Actually, that's easy. Not only was it the first true role-playing game to reach an American console, it was also the most impressive and substantial RPG to hit a Japanese console at the time of its Mark III debut a year earlier. The role-playing mania that had been bubbling beneath the surface of the console market in Japan in the mid-80s had finally burst to the surface and become a genuine mania by the time Phantasy Star arrived. As we all know, Dragon Quest gave that growing interest a conduit, a game carefully calculated by a team of developers, a famous comics artist, and one hell of a canny magazine publisher to take advantage of the Famicom audience's curiosity about RPGs. Dragon Quest took a while to catch on, but once it did, it became the hottest thing going. Phantasy Star arrived amidst a wave of 8-bit console RPGs inspired by the success of Dragon Quest, and its first sequel, all of which offered a welcome respite to game enthusiasts weary of baseball sims, bad Mario clones, and murder mystery adventures. Most of these early RPGs were, if we're being honest, pretty lousy. Phantasy Star stands out for being one of the handful that truly deserved attention, along with Square's original Final Fantasy and Atlus's digital devil story Megami Tensei. Every early RPG wore its influences on its proverbial sleeve, and most of them didn't bother with an origin story any deeper than, we really thought Dragon Quest and the money it made were neat. Phantasy Star did not slot easily into that category. Its creators clearly had a broad familiarity with the genre, and they created a game that specifically harkens back to the early Ultima titles, like Ultima 2 in particular. It gleefully blends a variety of different elements to create a unique game experience, mashing up science fiction and fantasy with the same enthusiasm with which it combines first-person dungeon crawling and a top-down travel viewpoint. Still, you'd be wrong to assume that Phantasy Star amounts to little more than Ultima 2 but with a D-pad. While this game certainly takes its notes from Origin Systems' Apple II Classic, Phantasy Star has a personality and focus all its own. Unlike nearly every other console RPG of the era, Phantasy Star doesn't bother with the blank slate protagonist. The hero, or rather heroine, doesn't simply have a predetermined appearance and name. She has a full backstory, a personal vendetta to drive her quest, and the agency to speak for herself. In a lot of ways, Phantasy Star feels more like a console RPG from the 90s than one from 1987-88. The trappings of role-playing are here: turn-based combat, an economy, random encounters, character experience and levels, an inventory system, even a touch of non-linearity. But Phantasy Star doesn't bother trying to present the illusion that the player has any real control over the direction of the quest or the story. Sure, you can, for example, wander into the dungeon ruled by Medusa, a fairly advanced boss, early in the game, but you can't sequence break. If you haven't managed to acquire the mirror shield you need in order to survive her petrifaction curse, you absolutely will not be able to defeat her early. No, your quest, or rather, heroine Alice Landale's quest, plays out in more or less a predetermined fashion. Every time you play through Phantasy Star, Alice meets the same allies along the way, completes the same side quests, gains access to the same gear, and battles the same bosses on the same planets as before. There's not a lot of flexibility to be found in Phantasy Star's systems, making it the most rigid of 1987's breakout Japanese console RPGs. Megaten at least allowed you to partner with and create new forms of different demons, and Final Fantasy let you roll a totally open-ended party from half a dozen different classes. But Phantasy Star's approach was clearly a deliberate creative choice. Sega had already published a totally open-ended roll-your-own-party console RPG at the beginning of 1987, a port of 1984's computer RPG The Black Onyx for SG-1000, and Phantasy Star feels like a conscious attempt to create something wholly different from that game. You always play as Alice, who is always spurred into action by the brutal murder of her brother at the hands of the oppressive Imperial police. Alice always teams up with a talking cat, Meow, a beefy warrior, Odin, and an androgynous maze, Lutz. Alice will always specialize in physical combat with the ability to learn some utility spells. Meow will always excel at healing and defense magic. Lutz will always pitch in as the combat mage, and Odin will always develop as a sheer meat wall bruiser with no magic aptitude. About all the freedom you have in building your party comes down to who gets the best equipment first, since it's all kind of expensive, and potentially allowing a weirdo to kill Meow and permanently remove him from the combat party. In other words, it's less a true RPG, quote-unquote, and more of a science fiction adventure in the vein of a contemporary anime OAV, a game that feels more like the Zillion cartoon than the actual Zillion game did. Alice and her team explore multiple worlds within the Algos star system, venturing to planets oppressed by the Lassic Empire, bartering for security passes to slip into fortress cities, and scrambling for the means to travel between worlds. Each world presents its own biome with distinct monsters to overcome and navigational hazards to surmount. The citizens who live on each world toil beneath their own localized form of imperial oppression, be it the boot heel of fascist police or the terror of an uncontained plague. And as Alice travels, her mission evolves through terse boxes of dialogue, expanding from a rage-fueled mission of family vengeance to determination to liberate the many peoples of Algo from Lassic's heartless tyranny. Although the linear nature of the adventure may throw its status as a true RPG into question for some purists, it makes Phantasy Star every bit as much a perfect entry point into the genre as the original Dragon Quest was. Though it's a far sight more sophisticated than Dragon Quest I, not to mention a hell of a lot more visually appealing. Some of that comes down to the obvious superiority of the Master System's graphical hardware versus that of the NES. With its expanded color palette and heftier sprite-pushing capabilities, the Master System creates a tile-based world that looks far more varied and vibrant than Dragon Quest's. Though of course it didn't hurt that Phantasy Star's ROM was 8 times larger than Dragon Quest's. But really, Phantasy Star made use of a lot of the same design tricks that Dragon Quest used to introduce newcomers to a complex and demanding genre. The story unfolds in a fairly linear fashion, and the plot unfurls as barriers within the world open up. The introduction of spaceports and interplanetary travel make for a pretty effective tool for limiting the player's progression. Sure, you may be able to wander in an open world and go anywhere you like, but only in a world. You have to work through the story to open up the others. And as in the original Dragon Quest, you shouldn't mistake Phantasy Star's accessibility for a lack of challenge. The game demands extensive exploration and the ability to put 2 and 2 together in order to track down quest objectives and move forward through the story. There's no hand-holding here. Additionally, you need to work your way through a ton of battles in order to gain experience and cash, level up, and purchase better gear. And an awful lot of those battles take place inside of dungeons, which are practically a game unto themselves. Harkening back to the early Ultima and Wizardry games, the bulk of Phantasy Star's quest consists of dungeon diving into complex 3D spaces that the player has to map on their own. The earliest dungeons don't necessarily require a ton of charting, but by the end of the game they grow into sprawling, complex affairs. And while the game manual includes extensive notes on spells, controls, and equipment, it doesn't contain a single dungeon map. Overworld maps, yes, but when it comes to the 3D labyrinths, you're left to your own devices. Moving through the underground corridors proves to be less of a chore here than in other 8-bit games though, because Phantasy Star manages to render those 3D passages with surprising smoothness. You can thank WizKid programmer and future felon Yuji Naka for that. After mucking around with completely impractical abuses of the Master System tech in order to add head-to-head multi-screen play to F-16 Fighting Falcon, Naka turned his technical acuity to more useful ambitions. He was the one who figured out how to make the console port of Space Harrier look and move a hell of a lot more like the arcade game than should have been possible. And for his victory lap, Naka put together a smooth 3D rotation routine for Phantasy Star's dungeons. Rather than simply jumping from one orthogonal view to another whenever the player taps the D-pad, Phantasy Star spins fluidly. This makes the process of maneuvering through dungeons a little slower than in other games of the era, but vastly less confusing. The addition of off-angle transitional animations helps ground the player and allows them to see the 3D space as a more consistent and real environment, which helps enormously with navigation. It also looks really cool. In fact, according to series illustrator and visual designer Rieko Kodama, RIP, Phantasy Star 2 and its sequels abandoned the 3D dungeons seen in the original game because the memory resources involved in creating a next-generation evolution of the lateral scrolling routine would have been prohibitively demanding. And these dungeons are also demanding for the player. They're taxing, as the enemies within tend to hit harder and appear more frequently than those in the overworld spaces. Most dungeon forays consist of multiple trips, with the party venturing further into the depths with each subsequent visit, just like in the Wizardry days. Altogether, Phantasy Star represents a synthesis of the old and new ways of the RPG format. It combines the sci-fi vibes and first-person dungeon crawler elements of early computer RPGs with the streamlined windowed menu system of Dragon Quest and its imitators. And with its focus on a central character and a driving narrative, Phantasy Star arguably plays like no other RPG before it. It guides the player without holding their hand, and it gives them an interesting plot and characters to connect with without totally locking down the game progression to a simple, linear path. It sounds a heck of a lot better than any RPG before it too, with a great soundtrack that included a rich FM-enhanced version in the Japanese cart. Interestingly, this was one of only 2 US carts to remove the FM code instead of simply dummying it out. Even as a 4 meg cart, there just wasn't enough space to include both English text and unusable audio programming. The good news is that here, in the year 2024, that limitation no longer exists. Phantasy Star has been revisited and remade more than any other single Master System original work. From its appearance in a Japan-only PlayStation 2 collection, to its inclusion on a Game Boy Advance compilation, to a modern-day Sega Ages overhaul on Switch, Phantasy Star has continued to thrive, even though the console itself has long since ridden off into the sunset, even in Brazil. And each version has brought new elements to the table. The PlayStation 2 version beefed up the in-game script, for example. The Switch version, however, is the rendition to play, having been comprehensively remastered by the wizards at M2. The Switch port includes multiple difficulty levels, which it achieves primarily by adjusting the values of experience and gold that the party earns in combat. It also includes vital quality of life features, such as in-game guidance on the stat attributes of equipment, explanatory text for inventory items, and an optional automap for the dungeons. It even allows Western kids to experience the FM soundtrack for the first time. And thanks to some serious effort by Phantasy Star mega fans, many of these features can also be accessed on Master System as well, through SMS Power's extensive ROM hack from a few years back. Which, incidentally, is how I captured most of the footage for this game. Look, I like authenticity and all of that, but I'm much too old at this point to be raw-dogging an 8-bit RPG on a tight deadline. But you don't need to take my word about all of this. Phantasy Star is one of the true RPG greats, a landmark title in the genre and on Master System. Other RPGs would build on the concepts presented here, but on 8-bit, nobody did it like Phantasy Star. Next time on Segaiden, it looks like Sega may have developed a bit of a role-playing kink.